I can live up to all this.
A couple of focus slides. Could you ask them to go through the focus slides for a minute?
Hold the slides. Hold the slides.
Well, just when you're ready to start. I'd like to use the 3 focus slides we have. Those will enable us to see whether the image on our projector
I thought I was speaking
crystal
today.
clear.
Marvin has always been this way. Most frequently, given an opportunity like this, I will probably talk about the current projects that I'm working on because it helps to stand up in public and try to explain what you're doing. I've decided really not to do that today. Sometimes when I don't do that, I might try to show the continuity between our earlier projects and the things we're working on now, because I think architects always do the same things. I think those that turn out to do something totally different 15 years later, well, I have questions about what they do. I think you can invent certain things, you can consolidate that kind of thinking, and then you reinvent it and go on from there. But as I say, I'm not going to do that today. Today's going to be a little bit different for both me and for you. I hope you can sit through this and not rush out before your next class starts. Today's a little bit more personal. Personal in that there are certain things that architects want to do, but they'd never tell their clients. We all want to make functional buildings. We all want to make buildings that look nice. We all sort of have agendas about things. I have almost always had a desire to make what I would call a modern stone building. This may seem like sort of an arcane idea, but I have always had an interest in stone. Why, I can't tell you. For a while I thought I might have been a sculptor. I used to beat up stones a lot. I enjoy walking in the countryside. I enjoy materials like that. So I thought I would talk to you today about stone and this crazy thing that I do as a sidelight. I could explain all our projects and why they are the way they are and tell you their little life stories, but I thought I would talk with you more about something I sort of have an interest in and I'm working out in my own lifetime, and my hope is that someday I will do a modern stone building. You can, when you walk through history, see that other architects have made their own versions of this in their time period. I would hope that I could sort out the messy time we live in and be able to do something not unlike that. I like stone. It's a particular material. It's of the earth. It has substance. It's solid. It's firm. And it also can be sensuous. And it does a lot of other things. Today, you can hardly convince a structural engineer that it could hold anything up. But if you look at the buildings of antiquity, they were the structure, the stones. So it's an unusual material in our age. The notion of making a modern stone building has been with me for a while. There's a question about whether I'll ever have really the opportunity to make a stone building. Because if I went to a job interview and I told someone I wanted to make a modern stone building for them, I'm not sure I would really be hired. Now, what has prompted me to come and do a lecture like this? When Marvin called me earlier in the year, he reminded me that this was the 25th anniversary of this school. I said, isn't that symmetrical? It's my 50th birthday. I didn't think that I could wait for the school's 50th birthday and my 75th, although I might have achieved my goal of making a modern stone building by then. I wasn't sure Marvin was going to be here then to invite me back. And really, Marvin is the reason I'm here, so I think I'll digress for a moment. Marvin was my taxi cab driver this morning, and I learned that I didn't really have my facts straight because I thought I had met Marvin much earlier in life than I really did. So my story is not quite accurate, but you'll have to excuse the few inaccuracies about it. Marvin and I did in fact grow up, or at least we were born, on the same block in Newark, New Jersey. It wasn't a very big block. It was sort of an unusual block in that on the corner of it there was a lot. A lot is a place where as an older kid, a teenager, you'd say, let's go down to the lot and play stickball. It was just a vacant piece of ground with junk and debris and some garbage in it. Well, I thought I was 4 years old, but clearly I must have been older. I was a small kid. I wasn't very tall. It always seemed to me that Marvin was always taller than I was, even when I was 4. And being the smallest kid on the block, and there were generally older kids, they decided, to always use the littlest kids for experiments. So there was this day when they decided that they were going to bury one of the kids. And it turned out that it was me. And I thought it was Marvin, but I may have this wrong. At least I attribute it to him.
My mother never let me do stuff.
They were about up to my shoulders when Marvin decided to go and tell my sisters that Malcolm was being buried in the lot on the corner of the block. And they had always told me never to play in that lot. And I actually had a hard time after that going back there to play there, but I sort of credit Marvin with saving me from being totally buried in this lot.
Tell him the name of the guy who lived behind you.
I'm not going to tell him any of this, Mark. This is my presentation tonight. If you want to sit in the back, you can go in the back. Put your driver's cap on and don't get tense. I didn't see Marvin for a number of years after this. He decided to move away from this luscious neighborhood in Newark. And actually, I went on, and as a boy, I decided that I could draw, and other people thought I could draft. So I worked in a bunch of offices, believe it or not, in downtown Newark, trying to be an architect. I thought I ought to try New York City. And one summer, while I was a year or two into college, I went to work at a firm called Kiley and Grusin. And in the offices that I had worked in Newark, there were a lot of fantastic, in those days you could call them draftsmen. That's what they were. They had gone to school at North Carolina A&T, and I don't think I've ever seen anybody who could draw that well. Well, they taught me a lot of skills. But when I got to Kiley and Grusin, there were a lot of people there who thought I knew absolutely nothing. And I sat in this great big wide open place with about 100 people changing concrete patterns because Corbu was in fashion, so the boards went this way or they went that way, and every time somebody changed their mind, you change the boards. Or you draw a stair detail, and finally Ray Tuccio came over and told me, you ought to learn how to really draft and how to letter properly, and gave me all these instructions, and it was absolute misery. The only delightful thing was that you could look out the window and sort of see the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth come up the Hudson River and dock. Well, one day I look over to the design department. The desks were spread out a little further apart. And there were only a half a dozen people over there. Lo and behold, Marvin is over in that area. I go, what is going on here? This is incredible. I had to work like crazy to get in here to be told how to letter and draft, and there's Marvin over there having a coffee break. Marvin decides to come over, and because I couldn't go into the design part, you weren't allowed to do that. Marvin came over to see me because he thought he recognized me from that day in the lot. And he did. He said hello. He told me he was going to a very good school, and that's in part why he was there, because the son of the owner of the firm was also going to that school. And we didn't speak very much after that for the rest of the summer, but we said adieu at the end of all that. It sort of shows you how lives are circular. After I finished school, I met almost directly after I met my partner Hugh, and we started to work together, and we had a little practice, and we eventually hired Norman, and he worked with us, and we were in practice for a couple of years, and we'd done a couple of little buildings. And I got a telephone call from Marvin. He said, how would I like to come and give a lecture at Ball State? I said, terrific, I'd love that, it would be great. I've been coming to Indiana anyway, so sure, I've never been to Muncie, it would be great fun. The night I came to give my lecture, there was a Ku Klux Klan meeting. I couldn't figure out where I was. It was fabulous. Marvin said, you're going to lecture in a really great place, and I was ushered into the Quonset hut. I had never seen so many people in a Quonset hut in my entire life. I had just come back from North Africa, and I was also interested in roadside attractions at that point. So my lecture that evening consisted of showing lots of mud buildings and people making them, and all this other debris from our own roadsides. I was all done. There was a pleasant round of applause. And Marvin said to me, "How come you didn't show your work?" I said, "Well, you didn't ask me to show my work." So Marvin looked at me a little curiously, and I thought maybe I had done the wrong thing. But in fact, we have had, and I don't blame it on that lecture, but we have had a steady stream of applicants from this institution apply to our office for jobs. Marvin would like to think we're just kind and hire people from Ball State. We actually only hire people who come out of school with some skills. And I would say in the last 20 years, we've probably had at least a dozen or 15 students from this institution working in our firm. And in fact, 3 of them do really quite fabulous work in our office, and I'll tell you a little bit more about them later. Who knows? If you have a 50th anniversary I'm around, I may come back and talk at that time also. But I feel like I have a lot of associations with the institution. I have a good sense about the students who go to school here, although I don't know any of them personally, because the ones I do get to see seem to me to have a lot of skills. And it seems to me that that's one of the things that a lot of educational institutions don't provide today. So when Marvin called and said, "Would I come and do this?" I said, "Absolutely, I'd love to do it." So without further ado, if I can find my slide machine operator, we'll have a few images. I have a large collection of debris at home. One of the things I collect are commemorative plates, but commemorative plates that other people have collected and then thrown in the refuse pile. I sort of collect other people's discarded souvenirs. I thought I had to bring this image to you because it said ideal Indiana. It's 2 words that I might not have otherwise associated together. I don't mean to insult you by that, but I looked on this plate and I said, my God, Ball State isn't on here. I said, Bedford, Indiana isn't on here. You know, there were a lot of things that Columbus isn't on here. How can this be the ideal Indiana? Nonetheless, I'd like you to know that Indiana hangs in my living room. I think about it every time I look at this place, and think about how ideal it is. Whoops, I did it wrong, sorry. This is David Rao. David Rao is a 1983 alumni of this institution. David and the next 2 people I'll show you, about a day after Marvin called me, I said, what should I talk about when I go to Ball State? What do you think the students there would like to hear about? And I asked these 3 people to help me out. Well, they did absolutely nothing. So 2 days ago I said, come into this room, I'm going to take your photograph because it would be impossible to go to Ball State and not tell them you work in our office. David is an associate in the office. David has worked with me on the design of the large auditorium in Anchorage. He's working on a number of our historic projects in New York City, and he's currently working on a small school project with me in Honolulu. David is quite terrific. Amelia Wagenbach, probably known to you as Amy Clark. Amy has just worked on a competition-winning design for the Niagara Falls toll booth that we've just won. Amy, in fact, runs our little computer operation that we have in the office. She's quite fantastic, and without her, we probably wouldn't be able to make a lot of the drawings that we do. She came and worked for us right out of school, decided that there were other places in the city where she could make more money, went and tried that for a couple of years, and in fact has come back and has been working for us for about the last 3 or 4 years. She's also a 1983 graduate. This ugly mug belongs to Jack Martin. Jack is a 1978 graduate, an original resident of Fort Wayne. Jack has worked on any number of projects in our office. When he first came, we put him to work on restoring Philip Johnson's design for the Rockefeller's townhouse that was purchased by someone else. And although he didn't get the details right, he could certainly draw. He's managed to survive. He's now working with me on a project we're doing at the University of Virginia for the business school. So I've just shown you these people. There are a lot of other people in my office, and have been a lot of others in 25 years, who have helped us make the buildings that we make. Allow me on days like this to come and talk to you at noontime instead of being in my office working hard. People think of nature as a lot of different things these days, a lot of concern about the environment, but usually we think about the things that grow and change a lot. And there are all these beautiful images that people have in their mind about what nature is all about. It's true that that is nature, but the part, for some reason, that I relate most strongly to are the parts that are made of stone. I don't go out and search these things out, but these are some photographs that I've taken over a long period of time. It is our natural environment. It is there for us to admire, and to a great extent, it is there for us to use in some way. The wonderful thing is that the stones that we see come in about every shape, form that we can imagine, and they're in every environment. When you see images like this, they look rugged, they look sturdy, they look like they'll be there forever. You find all sorts of formations, shapes, openings, and lots of wonderful things that have been created by nature. Man has been taking stone and doing things to it for an incredibly long period of time. It's not something new. And they never, seem to turn out the same, no matter even if they're made for the same purpose twice in a row. Today we make a lot of other things out of stone. Some are precious, some aren't. And you can almost do what you want with stone if you have the willpower and the energy and desire. To see a standing stone is quite miraculous. The energy that it took for some culture 3,000 years ago to stand up a piece of stone like this 30 feet tall is quite startling. When you walk through the countryside and it sort of looks like this, and you stumble on these things just draped about, and you realize how many thousands of stones were erected, it is a monument to the people who took the time to make these stone structures. From the photographs that I've seen around the school, obviously people have visited this fabulous monument. And when you realize the energy and effort that it took to move these blocks, people have been trying to make stone buildings of their time through the ages. And in Egypt, one can see them making different kinds of stone structures. Obviously, the temple for Hatshepsut, what Senmut did was so spectacular, he got buried in the doorway. But this was a different idea from some of the others about making a horizontal structure and a ramp. We all know these from our history class. They're quite fantastic. And they figured out how to use different kinds of stones for different kinds of structures, so the obelisks were in fact made out of granite. One of the most interesting things that happened to me in Egypt was to in fact go and see where the obelisk that broke was still in the ground, because you could in fact see how they cut it out, it then broke, and they just left it there. So you could in fact see the entire sort of 180 feet of it. You can almost see the pointed top down here at the bottom. You can get some sense of the achievement to do this in those times. It took a lot of energy and courage. In early sites in Greece, this one happens to be in Crete, how one used stone was less sophisticated than some of the later Greek buildings, but this site always amused me because they in fact carved off the top of the hill to in fact make the base of the building. So that in fact this piece is the top of the hill, and they built the rest of the building on top of it. It always seemed to me to be a wonderful thing to have done. So in fact, the building is part earth and part pieces. Obviously, we know all of these monuments, and the shaping of these stones to meet their desired needs. We sometimes forget what an achievement it was. All you need to do is sit next to one of these Roman pieces and you get a sense of the scale. We also know of all the decoration and how the Renaissance changed the use of stone and how wonderful it all is and how it was combined and put together in lots of different ways. How not only were people making buildings, but also doing sculpture and doing other great things with stone at that time. You can still visit Carrara and still see them taking stone out of the ground in the same place that they took it out in those days. The white stuff really is stone. Things have changed. Their work conditions are different, the materials are different, the plazas they built and the monuments they construct today look a lot different. The workmen on lunch hour, though, still need to sit down. So you find people still creating little events out of stone so they can make a comfortable place for themselves. This happens to be where some of the workmen eat during the course of a day. The Americas are no less rich in this tradition of making stone structures, and we know these are as well crafted as any. But in fact, the tradition in North America probably has more to do with stone walls, of which you can find millions of types laid up in lots of different ways, all quite elegant, all quite firm, and all quite pleasing to look at. I can remember when I first started to read about Frank Lloyd Wright, and I stumbled across the notion of organic architecture. I thought it was really going to be like this staircase that I found in northern Wisconsin up in Door County. I thought it had to do with building into the land. This is one of the most marvelous things I ever found. It's actually cut right into the side of the ledge, and it looks like it has in fact been there forever. We also have this great crazy tradition of making monuments for ourselves. And these are quite wonderful in this country, and for the last 150 years there are fabulous examples of what you can do with a piece of stone. In fact, that's a little basket with a handle on the top that you can actually put your hand inside of. Here, one uses stone as if it were putty. I mean, here is someone who's obviously died too soon in life, although he was a general. You know, it's the full sheaf of wheat that's been cut down in full bloom. And I mean, the symbolism of all these things. Stone was no less malleable than clay. This slide that's too dark is a great piece of Medina stone from northern New York State. It's what all the brownstone is made out of. It was specially selected so it would look like wood, and in fact has stone nails in it also. A lot of the stone buildings in America were quite simple. These are cobble buildings that permeate sort of a certain portion of New York State, and these are quite fabulous. So people through time have always been able to figure out how to make stone buildings of their own liking. Most frequently in America, the buildings are not the ones we consider major monuments, but this is a great Midwestern building that has a fabulous cornerstone column. Any architect would be proud, I think, to have shaped something like this. And the buildings are absolutely everywhere. Here's a brick building, but if you look at its base carefully, it has a piece of stone that has an arris at the corner, shaped at the edges, and even the standard blocks, you can see the chisel marks and the care of the curve. So stone is a material that is malleable and can be shaped to your needs. At one time, Americans tried to reflect in their architecture the nature of the country. This is Mr. Root, Mr. Burnham's partner. This is the Society Bank in Cleveland. There are lots of other examples like this. It's called American Romanesque, but I think they selected it because the stone was rough. It was not unlike our own country. And if you look at the capitals, they're big, fat, lumpy blocks that are not refined. They don't have acanthus leaves. But the most interesting detail about this building to me is the base of the column. It's as if the weight of the building has in some way almost melted the stone so that it's flowed out at the bottom. I don't understand what the derivation of this detail is, but it's one that I've always sort of marveled at. And it seems to me at this time there was a great interest in making stone buildings and detailing them in special ways. Americans have always copied borrowed from, whatever the words are, other cultures, and we've made our own monuments. But there's always been something funny about them. If this was a better slide, you'd see halfway up in the monument that the stone changes color. It's because they went to a different quarry, they fired the architect, and a general had to complete it. It's not unlike the story of many buildings in Washington. So we think about using stone, but when we come to do it these days, it's rather difficult. It's been sometimes easier to borrow other cultures' ornamentation. As we move closer to our own time period, the buildings seem to get flatter. But even in the flattest buildings, there's still a sense of the massiveness of the stone, the nature that it's come out of the ground. And even in these buildings built in the 30s and 40s in New York City, the detailing is still quite elegant, even when it comes to the modest windowsill, just to cut it down so the water will flow off. When we reach the 50s and 60s, the buildings are almost totally flat. And it has to do with the coming technology. We're able to rip the stones out of the ground much more quickly, and we're able to slice them up much more thinly. So the process has changed, the material is the same, and it's really a question of what we would like to do with these blocks after we saw them up. We can now make this stone almost as thin as glass. And because of that, we've seen a great renaissance and revival in the use of stone. In fact, we now glue it on buildings as if it were glass. This is not my particular vision of what to do with stone. You can see it on many mundane buildings. This happens to be a roadside attraction in New Jersey. This happens to be a piece of Indiana glued on a steel frame. And the corners are full of quirks. It looks like cardboard. It looks like someone's model of what a building is like. One can almost see the stone buckling at the joints. This is a way to make a column, but it doesn't really look like stone. It doesn't convey any of the sense of what the material is about. And when the glue begins to fail and the water begins to get in the joint, you get crazy staining that one would never associate with stone, but probably with foam core. There are many buildings that have been made in this fashion that are much more elegant and much more successful. And they've done it through certain little tricks and details that architects learn about. The AT&T building has one of these marvelous details. It's at the very bottom. It's this little piece here that fools you into believing that everything is really solid about the building and that this is turning into something else. And with a couple of very fat blocks at the bottom, the architect has tried to make you believe that this is really a solid stone building. In fact, when you begin to look at it, you realize that it's as flat and as thin as almost every other building around. One of my favorite buildings is this one. It's a court building in Lower Manhattan. It was built about 15 years ago. And it was when you could first begin to cut stone incredibly thin. And they have every type of the same stone here in terms of finish. It's been polished, it's honed, some rough pieces. And from a distance, you might be able to see a few little peculiarities. It's a very black building, but you can see these little spots all over it. Because they call me to jury duty, I get to see this building every once in a while. And the closer you look at it, you realize that the building is falling apart. That the little black things are screws, and when the screws have given up, the big aluminum pieces are in fact preventing total failure of the facade of the building. The notion that glue and steel frames and movement is not fully understood when you make a building this light and use that kind of material is one of the things a lot of architects are now grappling with. And it's not that one couldn't invent a technology that would work, but so far it's a little unproven. There are also other examples of people having a good time with stone. America has always been known for its follies, and you can find buildings not unlike this in the countryside. This happens to be the Madonna Inn in California. You can rent a room that has a stone feature in it. I think it comes out of the tradition of follies. It's quite a fabulous place. For an architect, there is no correlation between structure and skin and material because the stone is just used wantonly, absolutely everywhere. They've even made a stone gas station, and it's great to see the pumps hiding under these big boulders. So it's still possible to take stone and do what you want with it. The question is there any interest in that? Obviously, my answer is yes. Most other people don't even think about this as a topic. This is not something new to me. People ask now that you have bigger budgets, well, you can do whatever you want. Now you can be fancy and use stone. But in fact, there's always been a sense in our work to use certain materials properly. And even when we did the Mount Healthy School in Columbus, and instead of coming in at $19 and change a square foot, it came in at 20, we had to examine it so it would meet the budget. We still didn't give up the sense that in Indiana one should have stone lintels and stone sills, even in a very simple brick wall. Today, we do have different kinds of projects and different kinds of budgets and different kinds of functional requirements. But there's still this interest, and given the opportunity and not trying to stretch a point, we can explore different things. At the Virginia Museum, the West Wing, we had the opportunity to install a collection by Sidney and Francis Lewis and Mr. and Mrs. Mellon. And the interior spaces are gallery-like. They vary in size. The art changes. Some things are permanent. The building, though, is really an essay in masonry. In some ways, it is still too antique looking for me. This hasn't reached modernism. It's still somewhere back in the ages. This is, again, a portion of Indiana. It didn't get to be this way very easily because people will tell you to only glue your buildings together and to only use caulking. We had to discuss with the people in Bedford the fact that we would take the outsides of the blocks that they were going to cut up and give the insides to other people. You can see where they've come out of the ground and how hardly they've been wrenched. But this is, in fact, the Virginia job sitting on the ground. The blocks then got shaped, and this was a cheap way of having rusticated blocks. So it represents an economic use of a material that might not have been used. Here you can see the job before it got shipped to the site. Inside the building, there is a place called the Central Hall, which really is a place that everyone comes to before going to the two collections. We had proposed to use a marble from Italy, and we had suggested that we would grade it from the darkest to the lightest, from the bottom to the top, where the skylights were. Well, the chairman of the building committee thought that he better go and see this in Italy before it was installed in his building to see if it was going to be satisfactory for the people of the Commonwealth of Virginia. So we were all forced to go to Carrara to go and look at this stone. The stone normally would have been racked up like this, but I asked them in advance to lay it out on the ground. And much to the chairman of the building committee's surprise, he had to go up in a gondola to, in fact, see what it looked like. So what you see here is what happens to some building committee chairman when they decide that they need to go and see what stone looks like. But it's a rather complicated topic, and I can't show you all of this building here, but in fact, it's in place now, and in fact, the stone is graded from the top to the bottom. So even when the skylights aren't working, it is still lighter at the top than it is at the bottom. Currently, this out-of-focus slide shows you a model of a building that we're working on at Middlebury College. Middlebury has a lot of glorious buildings from the last century. They were mill buildings and stone buildings. It would have been impossible to go to Vermont and not make a structure that was in part stone. The problem is that people now sell you stone by the ounce. It's like, sort of like the teaspoon. So we went to Barry, where there's a company called Rock of Ages. They sell lots of granite. And we tried to discover how to get inexpensive stone to cover the two pieces that you see with the green hats on. They make rollers for the paper industry, 30 feet long. And they take them out of the ground in 30-foot long pieces, 8 feet square. They slice off the outside and then make them round. The outside have all the drill marks on them. I said we'd take the outside because it usually went into the slag heap. They said, oh, that's great, you take that. How much will that cost? Oh, it'll be very cheap. When they discovered that we were serious, they were going to charge us as much money for that as any dressed piece of finished granite. So in fact, the granite for this building is coming from Canada, from someone else who will supply it and who will allow us to chop it in some other ways. This building is currently under construction, and we in fact have two different kinds of stone. Because we can't use well-finished stone because of the labor and the cost, we've had to find other ways to use it in our buildings. One of the ways is to use curbing because it's very cheap. And in fact, people sell it very inexpensively. We also have big blocks because it seems to me that the bigger the block, the more economic it is and the more solid it also appears. So that under these two hats in the front, we're going to have some pink granite, and on some of the other pieces that are sort of lumping around here, I haven't really explained what this building is to you, but over here there's a big theater enclosure. These will be covered in a second type of granite, a gray-white granite. This is a small mock-up of the pink granite. It doesn't look very pink here, but it has a very unusual texture to it for a granite. It has stripes in it in addition to the speckles. It goes around the corners, and it has some reveals built into it in an attempt to make it look like a solid structure. We also have the gray-white granite. These are 18-inch high curbing pieces that come out of big blocks like these. They're then chopped up into little pieces like this, and when they're chopped, one gets an irregular surface. This is the beginning of the installation of an interior wall that is being laid up in the gray granite. The surprising part is from a distance, the wall looks almost true and flat and not as rough as I might have anticipated. When I come back for your 50th anniversary, I'll be able to show you this building complete. We're also working on a few other projects. This one is the Rundell Library in Rochester. It's an unusual building built in the 40s. It needs to expand. From the city, it looks complete. It also faces the Genesee River. And when it was built, it was built over the Erie Canal roadbed and a subway track. So in fact, we're going to expand the building down. It's sort of an unusual project, and we're going to build it out over the river. You can't see it here, but there are two adjacent bridges. They're both on the National Register, and one is in fact a landmark. We decided we'd like to make the extension below the building and out into the river out of stone blocks, 8 feet square and 4 feet high, and just pile them up as if it were a piece of archaic architecture. We finally found a structural engineer who believes that you can do that. So the addition to this side of the building will in fact look something like this, with the piers on this side of the building in fact being made out of some of those big blocks just sitting in the water and cascading up with brackets. This is a very schematic design, and although it looks rather classical, it won't be that way when it's completed. We're also working on a project at the University of Nebraska in its Omaha campus. It has a series of buildings which are less than distinguished that look something like this. It's the typical melange of a late 20th century campus, and it runs the full gamut. We're going to use a number of materials on this building, which sort of worms its way up to the campus, provides an interior corridor for kids to run around in inclement weather, and the black pieces in this plan will in fact be made of stone. We discovered someone in South Dakota who had a lot of stone for sale, granite, at $80 a ton. Usually you have a hard time buying it for $80 a square foot. If you took it out of this quarry as they take it out and as they palletize it, if you could figure out how to use it, you could have it. They're really in the monument business, and the stone is such that they can't tell because of the veining if it will be unsuitable for making a monument. So in fact, there are pallets full of material that looks like this, polished on two sides and rough on the other, that we're in fact going to be using at about $80 a ton to clad a number of the elements on the outside of this building. With that, I'm sort of going to conclude to tell you that stone and technology do come together. You may think I'm really an antiquarian because I've been talking about big stone blocks and putting them together in sort of old-fashioned ways. I think that we do use technology. We have a lot of it at our fingertips, but there's a question about what we do with it, what it symbolizes, and how it appears when we finished a structure. It could be as incongruous and jarring as this photograph, even though I find it amusing. Architecture really can't afford to be amusing because it's meant to last a really long time. And in conclusion, I thought I would just end with these couple of images. This is a detail from Thomas Cole's painting, The Architect's Dream. It's probably something you're familiar with. It's in the Toledo Museum. I've always sort of found it amusing because the architect is sitting on a pedestal reviewing plans and supposedly dreaming, I've always thought. In this image, he was dreaming of the classics. You can see that the Gothic building is in darkness and classicism is in light. In a way, it's not like the period we're working in. There's a lot of people who think that classicism is where we should be. I'm not sure I agree with that, but I agree with the notion that architects need to dream. I think if they don't dream and can't provide that for the people they work for, we're not really doing our job. On the other hand, we also work for other people. And just as I said, I couldn't tell any of my clients when they interview me that I'd like to make them the world's first modern stone building. I think that we also need to know that we work for other people. Here's an architect working for a person. Here you can tell that the architect, you can tell who the architect is. The architect is dressed in brown, the drabbest uniform there, whereas the client is wearing a very fancy robe and a lot of other things. In this case, it happens to be Michelangelo and the Pope. It turns out that architects always work for other people, and it's really through the combination of dreaming and working for others that we can hopefully see our own ambitions and those of our clients achieved. If you happen to go to Bedford and you're an architect, they may give you the state of Indiana with its seal on it. Don't tell them I told you this. Thank you very much.